interest, and support. That evening, as we sat on his back porch watching the sunset, he said something that captured how much had changed between us. I used to think being a good father meant having all the answers and sharing them whether you wanted them or not. Now I think it means trusting your judgment and being available when you need support. The insight reflected wisdom earned through years of learning, failure, and growth. He discovered that love expressed through control and judgment was less valuable than love offered through trust and acceptance. The lesson had come late in our relationship, but not too late to matter. Looking back now on the long journey from that humiliating ceremony to our current understanding, I can see that both of us had to lose something to gain something better. I had to lose the need for his approval to discover my own strength and independence. He had to lose his confidence in his own judgments to develop genuine empathy and respect for experiences different from his own. The relationship we'd built wasn't the one either of us had imagined years earlier, but it was stronger and more sustainable than what we'd lost. It was based on reality rather than expectations, acceptance rather than approval, and mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. Sometimes the best outcomes emerge from the worst moments, when crisis forces everyone involved to choose between comfortable deceptions and difficult truths. The general's intervention that day had given us no choice but to confront the dysfunction in our relationship, and we'd both chosen the harder path of genuine change over the easier path of pretending nothing was wrong. The compass he'd given me before my deployment had traveled with me to multiple continents and through countless briefings and operations. But its real significance wasn't navigational, it was symbolic of his faith in my direction and his respect for the journey I'd chosen. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded that sometimes the most valuable support comes not from people who understand everything about your path, but from people who trust you to find your own way. Thanks for staying with me. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that respect isn't optional. Quick questions for you. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with family? Was there a specific moment that made you finally draw the line? Did anyone step in to back you up, and how did that change things? If you've tried rebuilding trust, what actually helped or didn't? What would you tell your past self before that confrontation? Drop your answers in the comments, I read them. I'm Captain Christy Green, 28, a career officer who worked her way up from a small-town ROTC kid to safeguarding classified tech. For years, I covered for my younger sister, loaned money, smoothed messes, let borrowing slide because it was family. Then she lifted what she thought was my secondhand gadget for a date, actually a $1.5 million encrypted military asset, and I made a call that changed everything. Ever been dismissed or blindsided by someone you've poured yourself into? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line and defend it, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. Maya had always treated my things like community property. Growing up, she'd raid my closet without asking, borrow my homework to check her answers, and somehow my favorite books would migrate to her bedroom shelf. I told myself it was just sister stuff, the price of being close. But looking back, I should have seen the pattern forming, the way she'd test boundaries and push until I gave in. Can I borrow your black jacket? She'd ask, already pulling it from my closet. When I'd protest that I needed it, she'd flash that smile and say, come on, we share everything. And somehow, I always ended up letting her take it. Our parents encouraged this dynamic. Share with your sister, they'd say whenever I complained. Maya was 3 years younger, and they treated her like she needed protection from the world's sharp edges. I became the responsible one by default, the one who cleaned up messes and smoothed over conflicts. Maya got to be spontaneous and charming while I learned to anticipate problems before they happened. The habit followed us into adulthood. Even after I joined the military and she went to college, she'd text me asking to borrow things when I was home on leave. My car keys, my credit card for emergencies, my laptop when hers was acting weird. I'd gotten better at saying no, but Maya had gotten better at finding ways around my resistance. I'll pay you back, she'd promise, or I just need it for one night. And because I loved her, because she was family, I'd usually cave. Besides, what was the worst that could happen? A late return, a small inconvenience, maybe a lecture about responsibility that would go in one ear and out the other. The real problem wasn't the borrowing, it was the assumption that she could take what she wanted. Maya never seemed to consider that my things might be important to me, that I might have plans or boundaries she should respect. She operated from a place of automatic entitlement, as if the world owed her access to whatever she needed. I started noticing it more clearly during my last visit home. Maya was 25 now, working part-time at a boutique and living in our parents' guest house. She developed expensive tastes, designer handbags, trendy restaurants, a social media presence that required constant curation. When she couldn't afford something, she'd find creative ways to get it. "Your perfume smells amazing," she said one morning, appearing in my childhood bedroom as I got ready for a meeting with old friends. Before I could respond, she'd sprayed it on her wrists. "Thanks, I have a thing tonight." "Maya, that's a $50 bottle. I'll buy you a new one." But we both knew she wouldn't. She'd forget, or claim she was broke, or find some way to make me feel petty for bringing it up. The friends I met that day had their own Maya stories. Sarah mentioned her missing earrings after Maya had admired them at a party. Jessica rolled her eyes talking about how Maya had borrowed her expensive foundation and never returned it. They were fond of her, everyone was fond of Maya, but they'd learned to hide their valuables when she was around. "She doesn't mean anything by it," I found myself saying, the same defense I'd been making for years. "She's just scattered sometimes." But was she scattered, or was she strategic? Maya seemed to have perfect recall when it came to things she wanted, but convenient amnesia when it came to returning them. She remembered every favor I'd done for her but forgot every boundary I'd tried to set. The pattern was getting worse, not better. Maya's boyfriend had broken up with her the month before, partly because she'd taken his expensive watch to get it cleaned and somehow lost it. She'd been dating more frequently since then, always looking for someone to impress, someone to fund the lifestyle she wanted but couldn't afford. "I need to make a good impression," she'd told me when she borrowed my designer scarf for a first date. "You understand, right? You want me to be happy." And I did want her to be happy. But I was starting to understand that my happiness didn't factor into her calculations. Maya took what she needed and left me to deal with the consequences. She'd apologize later, promise to do better, and then repeat the same behavior the next time an opportunity arose. The last night of my leave, I'd laid out my gear to pack the next morning. Everything had its place, uniforms folded precisely, equipment checked and organized. Maya had wandered in while I was saying goodbye to our parents, and I'd found her examining my things with that familiar acquisitive look. "This stuff is so cool," she'd said, running her fingers along the edge of my tactical bag. "It's like having a secret identity." "It's not a game, Maya." "I know that." But her tone suggested otherwise, like my military career was an interesting hobby rather than a serious profession with serious responsibilities. I should have locked my door that night. Should have been more explicit about what was off limits. But we were family, and despite everything, I still trusted her not to cross certain lines. I thought she understood that some things were different, that some boundaries were absolute. Maya had always been good at reading people, at finding the exact moment when their defenses were down. She knew how to time her requests, how to frame them so they seemed reasonable. She knew I loved her, knew I wanted to protect her, and she'd learned to use that knowledge to get what she wanted. But love and boundaries weren't mutually exclusive, even if Maya had never learned that lesson. I was beginning to realize that my willingness to accommodate her hadn't helped either of us grow. She'd never learned to respect limits because I'd never enforced them consistently. And I'd never learned to value my own needs because I'd been taught that being a good sister meant sacrificing them. The next morning, I'd packed carefully and methodically, the way the military had trained me. Everything in its place, everything accounted for. I thought I'd checked everything twice, but Maya was practiced at taking things without leaving obvious gaps. By the time I realized what was missing, I was already back at base, and she was already making her plans. I settled into my routine during the following weeks, throwing myself into training exercises and briefings. The familiar rhythm of military life felt good after the emotional complexity of being home. Here, rules were clear and consequences were immediate. People said what they meant and meant what they said. There was something refreshing about that clarity after dealing with Maya's elaborate justifications and selective memory. But late at night, lying in my narrow bunk, I'd think about that look in her eyes when she'd examine my gear. The way she dismissed my warnings about boundaries, about the difference between borrowing a scarf and crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Maya had always believed that wanting something was justification enough for taking it. I was about to learn just how dangerous that philosophy could be. 3 weeks later, her text arrived while I was reviewing classified briefing materials. The message was casual, almost breezy. Borrowed your cool gadget for tonight. Thanks, sis. My blood went cold as I realized what she'd done, what she thought she'd taken, and what was actually at stake. Maya had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and this time, I wouldn't be able to protect her from the consequences. The device Maya had taken wasn't a cool gadget. It was a classified military communication array worth $1.5 million, equipped with encryption protocols that could compromise national security if they fell into the wrong hands. And my sister had just announced she was taking it on a date, treating it like a conversation piece to impress some guy she'd met online. My hands shook as I read her message again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But there was no mistake. Maya had seen the device in my gear, assumed it was some kind of advanced phone or tablet, and decided it would make her look mysterious and sophisticated. She had no idea that possessing it without authorization was a federal crime, that even I had strict protocols for its transport and storage. I tried calling her immediately, but the phone went straight to voicemail. Of course it did. Maya always silenced her phone when she was getting ready for dates, claiming she needed to focus on her energy. I left 3 increasingly urgent messages, each one more explicit about the serious nature of what she'd taken. She'd have to check her phone eventually, but by then it might be too late. The protocol for missing classified equipment was clear and non-negotiable. I had to report it immediately, regardless of the circumstances. But this wasn't just any missing equipment. This was my sister, my family, someone I'd spent my whole life protecting. Every instinct I had screamed at me to find another way, to fix this quietly before anyone else knew what had happened. But Maya had put me in an impossible position. If I didn't report the breach and someone discovered it later, my career would be over. I'd be court-martialed for failing to protect classified assets. And if the device was compromised, if Maya's date turned out to be foreign intelligence, or if she posted photos of it online, the damage to national security could be catastrophic. I stared at my phone for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Then I dialed base command. This is Captain Green. I need to report a potential security breach involving classified equipment. The words came out steady and professional, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. Nature of the breach, Captain? A classified communication device is currently in unauthorized possession outside the base perimeter. I need to initiate immediate recovery protocols. I gave them the device's serial number, its current estimated location based on Maya's social media posts, and a timeline of when it had gone missing. Understood, Captain. Initiating lockdown procedures. Recovery team will be dispatched immediately. I hung up and immediately tried Maya again. Still voicemail. She was probably at some trendy restaurant downtown, showing off what she thought was cutting-edge consumer tech to a guy who was probably more interested in her cleavage than her gadgets. Maya had always been beautiful in that effortless way that opened doors and made people forgive her mistakes. But beauty wouldn't protect her from what was about to happen. The recovery team would be armed military police with orders to secure the device by any means necessary. They wouldn't care that Maya was young and naive, that she didn't understand what she'd done. They'd treat her as a potential security threat until proven otherwise, and Maya had never responded well to authority or confrontation. I tried to imagine the scene, Maya sitting across from her date, maybe pulling out the device to show him the interesting design, completely unaware that she was committing a federal crime. Then armed soldiers would storm into the restaurant, shouting orders, forcing everyone to the ground while they secured the area. Maya would be terrified, confused, probably crying. Her date would think he'd walked into some kind of spy movie. The worst part was that Maya would genuinely not understand why this was happening. In her mind, she'd borrowed something from her sister, the way she'd borrowed 100 things before. She'd never grasped the difference between my personal belongings and my professional equipment, never understood that my military career involved real stakes and real consequences. 20 minutes after I made the call, my phone rang. It was Colonel Martinez, my commanding officer. "Green, we've recovered the device. The subject has been detained for questioning." "Sir, the subject is my sister. She didn't understand what she'd taken." That's what she claimed. She kept saying it belonged to her sister and that she was just borrowing it. She seemed genuinely surprised by our response. His tone was neutral, professional, but I could hear the unspoken question: how do we have a captain who can't secure her own equipment from family members? "Sir, I take full responsibility for the security breach. The device was properly stored, but I failed to account for my sister's access to my quarters during my leave. We'll need a full debriefing, Captain. And your sister will need to be processed through security screening before she can be released. This kind of breach, even if unintentional, requires thorough documentation." After he hung up, I sat in my empty barracks room and tried to process what had just happened. Maya was probably in a holding cell right now, finally understanding that her actions had consequences beyond her immediate desires. Her date had likely been detained as well, questioned about his connection to her and his knowledge of the device. Both of their names would be flagged in federal databases as potential security risks. But more than that, Maya had forced me to choose between protecting her and protecting my duty. For the first time in our relationship, I'd chosen duty, and we were both going to have to live with the consequences of that choice. Maya would learn that some boundaries were absolute, and I would learn that love sometimes meant letting people face the results of their own decisions. The device was secure, my career was intact, and national security had been preserved. But as I prepared for what would certainly be hours of paperwork and questioning, I couldn't shake the image of Maya's face when those soldiers had surrounded her table. She'd finally encountered a situation where her charm and family connections couldn't protect her, where being sorry wasn't enough to fix what she'd broken. And despite everything, part of me still wished I could have found another way. Maya and I had always been different, but our childhood had masked those differences behind shared experiences and family loyalty. She was the spontaneous one, quick to laugh, and quicker to find someone else to solve her problems. I was methodical, responsible, the one who thought through consequences before acting. Our parents had praised these differences as complementary, as if we were two halves of one whole. But as we grew older, those differences had created an increasingly unstable dynamic. Maya's spontaneity had evolved into impulsiveness, and my responsibility had become a safety net that enabled her reckless behavior. Every time I'd covered for her mistakes or bailed her out of trouble, I'd reinforced the lesson that someone else would always be there to catch her when she fell. I remembered the time she'd crashed Dad's car in high school, how I'd helped her practice her story so he wouldn't ground her before prom. Or when she'd maxed out her credit card in college, how I'd loaned her money to make the minimum payments so her credit wouldn't be ruined. At the time, these had seemed like acts of love, the things sisters did for each other. But Maya had never returned the favor. When I'd struggled through basic training, dealing with instructors who seemed determined to break me down, Maya had been too busy with her sorority rush to offer support. When I'd been deployed overseas for the first time, scared and homesick, her letters had been full of college drama and boyfriend troubles, never acknowledging what I was going through. The pattern had been consistent throughout our relationship. Maya's needs were urgent and immediate, while mine could always wait. She operated in crisis mode, lurching from one emergency to another, always needing rescue. I operated in maintenance mode, steadily building a career and a stable life, always available to provide that rescue. Our parents had encouraged this dynamic without realizing its long-term costs. "Your sister needs you," Mom would say whenever I expressed frustration with Maya's latest disaster. "She's not as strong as you are." But strength, I was beginning to understand, was partly a matter of practice. Maya had never been required to be strong because I'd always been there to be strong for her. The military had shown me a different way of thinking about responsibility and consequences. In the Army, everyone was accountable for their own actions and their impact on the mission. You couldn't charm your way out of a failed objective or blame someone else for your mistakes. Excellence was expected, not negotiated, and trust was earned through consistent performance over time. Maya had visited me at base once, during my second year of service. She'd been impressed by the ceremony and tradition, excited by the uniforms and the sense of purpose. But she'd also been frustrated by the rules, the early wake-up calls, the way everything had to be earned rather than given. "It's so rigid," she'd complained. "Don't you miss being able to just be yourself?" But this was myself, disciplined, focused, part of something larger than my own immediate desires. Maya couldn't understand that identity because she'd never experienced the satisfaction of submitting personal wants to collective needs. She'd never learned that some things were more important than being comfortable or getting what you wanted right away. The security breach had crystallized everything I'd been trying not to see about our relationship. Maya didn't respect my boundaries because I'd never enforced them consistently. She didn't take my career seriously because I'd never shown her that it took precedence over her convenience. She treated my things as community property because I'd never demonstrated that some things were absolutely off-limits. But the classified device had been different. This wasn't about hurt feelings or inconvenience. This was about national security, about trust that had been placed in me by people who counted on my discretion and judgment. Maya's assumption that she could take what she wanted had collided with a world where assumptions could have life-or-death consequences. I thought about her face when the military police had surrounded her table, the confusion and terror in her eyes. Maya had never experienced real consequences before, never been forced to confront the gap between her intentions and her impact. She genuinely believed that wanting to impress her date was justification enough for taking classified military equipment. The hours after the incident had been filled with debriefings, paperwork, and questions from investigators who needed to understand how the breach had occurred. I'd answered everything honestly, explaining Maya's history of boundary issues and my own failure to secure my equipment adequately. My commanding officers had been professional, but clearly concerned about my judgment in family matters. "This can't happen again, Captain," Colonel Martinez had said at the end of my formal review. "Personal relationships cannot compromise operational security, regardless of the circumstances." He was right, and I knew it. Maya's behavior hadn't changed over the years because I'd never required it to change. Every time I'd accommodated her impulsiveness or cleaned up her mistakes, I'd sent the message that her comfort was more important than my boundaries. But those boundaries weren't just personal anymore. They were professional, legal, and crucial to national security. The investigation had cleared me of deliberate wrongdoing, but it had also made clear that my career depended on preventing future breaches. Maya would be flagged in security databases, barred from accessing any military facilities or personnel without explicit authorization. If she tried to contact me at work or visit the base, she'd be treated as a potential security threat. More painful than the professional consequences was the realization that I'd enabled Maya's behavior for years. My willingness to sacrifice my own needs for hers hadn't helped either of us grow. It had trapped us both in a cycle of irresponsibility and resentment. Maya had never learned self-control because she'd never faced real consequences, and I'd never learned to prioritize my own needs because I'd been trained from childhood to prioritize hers. But the device recovery had changed everything. For the first time in our relationship, I'd chosen my duty over Maya's convenience, and both of us were struggling to understand what that meant. Maya was learning that some actions couldn't be undone with apologies and charm, while I was learning that love sometimes required allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. Maya called me 3 days after the incident, her voice small and shaken. She'd been released after 12 hours of questioning, but the experience had rattled her badly. The federal background check would remain on her record permanently, potentially affecting future employment and travel. Her date had never called her again, and the story had somehow made its way onto social media, making her a temporary object of ridicule in our hometown. "I didn't know," she said, crying. "I thought it was just some cool tech thing. I never meant for this to happen." "I know you didn't mean it, Maya. But meaning it and knowing the consequences are different things. You took something that wasn't yours without asking, and this time it mattered more than we could afford. Are you angry with me?" I considered the question carefully. I'm angry that you put me in an impossible position. I'm angry that you never asked what the device was or why I might have it. But mostly, I'm sad that our relationship has reached a point where you felt entitled to take something so important without thinking about the consequences. Maya was quiet for a long time. Then, what happens now? Now you deal with the consequences of your choices, and I deal with the consequences of mine. We both learned to do better. The conversation had ended awkwardly, with promises to talk soon that neither of us was sure we meant. Maya was facing her first real accountability crisis, while I was learning to prioritize professional obligations over family loyalty. We were both discovering that growing up sometimes meant accepting that love alone wasn't enough to bridge every gap or fix every mistake. But something had shifted permanently between us, something that couldn't be restored with apologies or good intentions. Maya had crossed a line that changed how I saw both her and our relationship, while I had enforced a boundary that changed how she saw me. We were both different people than we'd been before the incident, and our relationship would need to be different too. The weeks following the security breach passed in a strange combination of relief and tension. Maya had gone silent after our phone call, retreating to our parents' house and avoiding social media for the first time in years. I threw myself into work, determined to prove that the incident had been an aberration rather than a pattern of poor judgment. My colleagues treated me with cautious professionalism, clearly aware of what had happened but uncertain how to address it. Captain Williams, who'd been through her own family crisis the year before, was the only one who spoke to me directly about it. The hardest part isn't the paperwork or the investigation, she'd said during a quiet moment between briefings. It's realizing that the people we love most can also put us in the most danger. She was right. Maya's betrayal hadn't been malicious, but it had been complete. She'd taken something crucial to my career and my country's security, treating it like a toy to impress a stranger. The casual nature of her text message had been almost worse than deliberate sabotage. At least malice would have suggested she understood the stakes involved. But Maya operated in a world where stakes were always personal and immediate. She'd been raised to believe that wanting something badly enough was justification for having it, that other people existed primarily to facilitate her happiness. Our parents had never required her to consider the broader impact of her choices, never taught her that some things were more important than her immediate desires. The military had taught me different lessons about accountability and sacrifice. Every decision I made affected not just me but my unit, my mission, and ultimately the security of people I'd never meet. Maya's worldview couldn't accommodate that kind of responsibility because she'd never been required to think beyond her own immediate circle. 3 weeks after the incident, Maya finally texted me again. Not an apology or an explication, but a simple message: "Can we talk?" I stared at the text for several minutes, remembering all the times I'd dropped everything to respond to her requests. But this time, I waited until my duty shift was over before calling her back. "I've been thinking," Maya said without preamble, "about what you said, about consequences and choices. I talked to Mom and Dad about everything that happened." "What did they say?" "They wanted to know why you didn't call them first, why you reported me instead of trying to handle it privately." Maya's tone was carefully neutral, but I could hear the underlying question. Why had I chosen duty over family loyalty? Because some things are bigger than family, Maya. Because that device could have compromised national security if it had been lost or damaged. Because my job is to protect things that are more important than our comfort or convenience. But I'm your sister. Yes, you are. And that's exactly why this hurts so much. I took a breath, trying to find words for something I was still figuring out myself. Maya, I love you. I've always loved you. But love doesn't mean pretending that actions don't have consequences or that wanting something is the same as deserving it. Maya was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, younger. "I keep thinking about those soldiers, how they looked at me like I was a criminal. I've never been afraid like that before. I didn't know people could be so serious about things. The world is full of serious things, Maya. I've been trying to protect you from that reality, but I think I did us both a disservice. You never learned to navigate serious consequences because I always stepped in to shield you from them. So you're not going to protect me anymore?" The question hit me harder than I'd expected. Maya had always been my responsibility, my burden, and my joy. Protecting her had been central to my identity as a sister, a daughter, a family member. But protection without growth wasn't love, it was enabling. "I'm going to love you and respect you enough to let you handle your own consequences," I said finally. "That's a different kind of protection than what I've been offering. I don't know how to do that." "You'll learn. People are capable of more than we give them credit for when they have to be." The conversation had ended with tentative plans to meet for coffee during my next leave, but both of us knew it would be different. Maya could no longer assume automatic access to my resources or my willingness to fix her mistakes, while I could no longer assume that family loyalty trumped professional obligations. Over the following days, I found myself grieving the relationship we'd had while simultaneously feeling hopeful about the relationship we might build. Maya would need to learn accountability and self-control, skills she should have developed years earlier. I would need to learn to maintain boundaries with someone I loved, to resist the impulse to rescue her from every difficulty. The security incident had been a crisis, but it had also been a clarification. Maya and I had been living in different worlds for years, pretending that love alone was enough to bridge the gap between her impulsiveness and my discipline. The classified device had forced us to confront the real costs of that pretense. My phone buzzed with another text from Maya. "I've been looking for a job, a real one. Something with actual responsibilities. I thought you should know." I smiled, typing back, "That sounds like a good start." It wasn't an apology or a promise, but it was acknowledgement. Maya was beginning to understand that respect was earned through actions, not intentions. And I was beginning to understand that the best way to love someone wasn't always the easiest way. We were both learning to be adults, finally, at 28 and 25. It had taken a federal security breach to get us there, but maybe that was what it had taken. Maybe some lessons couldn't be learned gently, could only be absorbed through the shock of real consequences. Maya and I were both changing, becoming people who could handle truth and accountability. It remained to be seen whether those new people could build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than automatic accommodation. But for the first time in years, I was optimistic about our chances. Maya's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was consistent in ways that surprised both of us. She found a job at a local bank, starting as a teller and gradually working her way into customer service roles that required discretion and attention to detail. She stopped posting constant updates on social media, stopped treating every social interaction as a performance designed to maximize attention and admiration. When we finally met for coffee 6 months later, she looked different, more grounded, less frantic. She'd cut her hair shorter, traded the designer knockoffs for professional clothing that fit her actual budget. She seemed more present, less constantly distracted by her phone or by scanning the room for more interesting people to engage. "I've been thinking about what you said," Maya began, stirring her coffee absently. "About consequences and responsibility. I realized I'd never really faced serious consequences before, not ones that couldn't be fixed by apologizing or finding someone to help me. How does that feel?" "Scary. But also kind of freeing? Like, I know where I stand now. I know that my choices matter and that I can't rely on other people to fix things when I mess up." She looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "I'm sorry, by the way. Not just sorry that you got in trouble, but sorry that I put you in that position in the first place. I appreciate that. I keep thinking about how casual I was about it, how I just took something that belonged to you without even asking what it was. I can't imagine doing that now." Maya shook her head. "It's like I was living in this bubble where other people's stuff was just available to me whenever I wanted it." We talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation we'd had in years that wasn't centered around Maya's latest crisis or need. She told me about her job, about learning to emcristage her own finances, about a relationship she'd ended because she realized she was dating the guy primarily for his willingness to pay for expensive dinners. "I think I was using people," she admitted. "Not maliciously, but just assuming that their job was to make my life easier or more interesting. I never thought about what I was contributing to their lives or whether what I was taking was fair." I shared some of my own growth, about learning to maintain boundaries with people I loved, about the difference between helping someone and enabling them. Maya listened without defending her past behavior or trying to minimize the impact of her choices. The hardest part, she said as we prepared to leave, is realizing how much I missed by always looking for the easy way out. I never learned to appreciate things because I never had to work for them. I never developed real relationships because I was always focused on what people could do for me. But you're learning now. Yeah, I am. It's slower than I'd like, and definitely harder than I expected. But I like who I'm becoming better than who I was. Maya had gained something valuable from losing her automatic safety net, self-respect earned through actual accomplishment, relationships based on mutual benefit rather than one-sided extraction. She was learning to solve her own problems and handle her own emotions without constantly seeking external validation or rescue. The change in our dynamic was remarkable. Maya no longer assumed I would drop everything to help her or that my resources were automatically available to her. When she mentioned problems at work or challenges with friends, she talked about how she was handling them rather than looking to me for solutions. I wanted to ask your advice about something, she said during one of our regular phone calls, but I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to fix it for me. It was a small thing, but it represented a huge shift in how Maya approached relationships. She was learning to value other people's time and energy, to contribute to conversations rather than just extracting support from them. My own growth was less visible but equally significant. I'd learned to resist the automatic impulse to solve Maya's problems, to offer support without taking responsibility for outcomes I couldn't control. I discovered that loving someone didn't require sacrificing my own needs or compromising my professional obligations. The military had reinforced these lessons through daily practice, but Maya's crisis had made them personal. I couldn't be a good soldier and a good sister by enabling irresponsible behavior, even behavior motivated by love or family loyalty. Real love required holding people accountable for their choices and trusting them to handle the consequences. Maya's growth gave me permission to focus on my own career and goals without constant worry about her latest crisis. I was promoted to major 2 years after the security incident, partly because my commanders could see that I'd learned to maintain appropriate boundaries between personal and professional responsibilities. You've become more decisive, Colonel Martinez observed during my performance review. More willing to make difficult choices when they're necessary for the mission. He was right. Maya's crisis had taught me that avoiding difficult conversations or decisions didn't make them go away, it just delayed them until they became more serious and more costly. I'd learned to address problems early and directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. Maya and I had built a new relationship based on mutual respect rather than automatic accommodation. We enjoyed each other's company without constantly negotiating boundaries or expectations. Maya had learned to appreciate what I offered without taking it for granted, while I had learned to offer support without sacrificing my own needs. I'm proud of us, Maya said during a family dinner the year after our first coffee meeting. We figured out how to be sisters without driving each other crazy. Our parents had been slower to adjust to the new dynamic, still occasionally trying to recruit me to solve Maya's problems or expecting Maya to rely on family support rather than handling things independently. But both of us had learned to redirect those expectations, to demonstrate through consistent behavior that we'd both changed. Maya's doing really well, Mom had said to me privately, with a note of surprise that suggested she'd never expected Maya to develop actual life skills. She is. She's learned to be responsible for her own choices. And you've learned to let her be responsible for them. It was true. The hardest part of Maya's growth had been learning to trust it, to resist the impulse to step in whenever she faced difficulties. But Maya had proven herself capable of handling challenges that would have overwhelmed her in the past, and I'd learned that my faith in her competence was itself a form of support. We were both better people for having navigated the crisis together, even though, especially because we'd navigated it by maintaining our separate responsibilities rather than trying to share them. Maya had learned accountability, and I had learned the difference between love and enabling. Those lessons had made us better sisters and better adults. The restaurant incident had become family lore, the story we told to illustrate how dramatically people could change when they were required to face consequences. Maya told it as a story about growing up, about learning that actions had meaning beyond immediate intentions. I told it as a story about boundaries, about the importance of maintaining professional integrity even when personal relationships were at stake. Both versions were true, and both had shaped who we'd become. Maya was now someone who could be trusted with serious responsibilities, while I was someone who could maintain necessary boundaries with people I loved. We'd both learned that respect and accountability were prerequisites for healthy relationships, not obstacles to them. 3 years after the security breach, Maya had been promoted to assistant Christager at her bank branch. She'd earned the position through consistent performance and demonstrated judgment, qualities she'd never developed when her mistakes were automatically cleaned up by others. She'd also started dating someone who valued her competence and reliability rather than her willingness to be entertaining or accommodating. "He's different from the guys I used to date," Maya told me. "He actually listens when I talk about work, asks thoughtful questions about things that matter to me. It's weird how much more attractive stability is than drama." Maya had learned to value partners who respected her boundaries rather than testing them, who contributed to her life rather than extracting from it. She discovered that relationships built on mutual respect were more satisfying than relationships built on constant negotiation and accommodation. I'd learned similar lessons in my own life, becoming more selective about friendships and romantic relationships. The experience with Maya had shown me the importance of establishing clear expectations early and maintaining them consistently. I'd stopped trying to earn love through constant accommodation and started building relationships based on shared values and mutual respect. "You seem more confident," my friend Jessica observed during a weekend visit. "More settled in who you are." It was true. Learning to maintain boundaries with Maya had taught me to maintain boundaries generally, to value my own time and energy enough to protect them from people who would waste them carelessly. I'd become someone who could be counted on because I knew my own limits and communicated them clearly. The military had provided the framework for these lessons, but Maya's crisis had made them personal and immediate. I'd learned that professional integrity and personal relationships weren't competing priorities. They were complementary aspects of living with consistent principles and clear boundaries. Maya and I met for lunch on the 4th anniversary of the incident, though neither of us mentioned the date explicitly. She looked professional and confident in a way that would have been unimaginable during her crisis period. She'd been Christaging her own team for 6 months, handling personnel issues and client relationships with the kind of thoughtful judgment she'd never displayed in her personal life before learning it professionally. "I had to fire someone last week," Maya told me matter-of-factly. She kept coming in late and making excuses instead of addressing the problem. 2 years ago, I would have covered for her or tried to fix it myself. But I realized that helping her avoid consequences wasn't actually helping her grow. It was a complete reversal from the person who'd once expected others to cover for her mistakes and minimize the impact of her poor choices. Maya had learned not just to handle her own responsibilities, but to require accountability from others. She developed the confidence to make difficult decisions when they were necessary for the team's success. How did she take it? Not well initially. She accused me of being heartless and said I didn't understand her situation. But by the end of the conversation, I think she realized I was treating her like an adult capable of making better choices. That was more respectful than constantly making excuses for her would have been. Maya had internalized the lesson that accountability and respect were connected, that holding people to high standards was a form of care rather than cruelty. She'd learned to see consequences as information rather than punishment, as necessary feedback that allowed people to adjust their behavior and grow. The transformation extended beyond her professional life. Maya had developed a small circle of close friends based on shared interests and mutual support rather than the larger, more superficial social network she'd maintained before. She'd learned to value quality over quantity in relationships, depth over breadth in connections. "I was talking to Sarah the other day," Maya said, referring to one of our mutual friends from high school. "She mentioned that she trusts me now in ways she didn't before. She said I used to be fun but unreliable, and now I'm someone she can actually count on." How does that feel? Better than I expected. I thought being reliable would be boring, but it's actually more satisfying than being entertaining. People share more with me now, ask for my opinion on serious things. I feel like I matter to them as a person rather than just as entertainment. Maya had discovered that earning trust created deeper, more meaningful relationships than demanding attention ever had. She'd learned that consistency was more valuable than charisma, that people preferred dependability to drama in their important relationships. We talked about my own life, about the promotion I was being considered for that would involve significant leadership responsibilities. Maya asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of emcristiging people, about balancing competing priorities and maintaining team cohesion. Her questions demonstrated genuine interest in my professional growth rather than just polite inquiry. "You're good at this stuff," Maya observed. "The leadership and decision-making. You always were, but I think I used to take it for granted. I never really appreciated how much thought and discipline it takes to be someone people can rely on." It was one of the most perceptive things Maya had ever said about my character, and it meant more because it came from someone who'd learned to value those qualities through her own experience developing them. Maya's growth had given her the perspective to understand mine, to appreciate the effort and sacrifice involved in maintaining consistent standards. "I think we're both better at seeing people clearly now," I replied. "We don't expect them to be perfect, but we expect them to be accountable for their choices." "Yeah, and we're both better at being seen clearly too. I used to hate it when people had expectations of me because I was afraid of disappointing them. Now I appreciate expectations because they mean people think I'm capable of meeting them." Maya had learned that other people's faith in her competence was a gift rather than a burden, that being held to high standards was a sign of respect rather than criticism. She developed the confidence to disappoint people occasionally rather than constantly trying to emcristage their expectations through charm and deflection. As we finished lunch and prepared to return to our respective responsibilities, I reflected on how far we'd both traveled from the people we'd been 4 years earlier. Maya had grown from someone who avoided accountability into someone who embraced it, while I'd grown from someone who enabled others' irresponsibility into someone who required growth and self-reliance. "I'm glad it happened," Maya said suddenly as we walked to our cars. "The whole thing with the device, the arrest, the investigation. I'm glad I had to face real consequences for once." "Really?" "Really. I was living in this fantasy where my choices didn't matter because someone would always fix things for me. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to me either. I never got to find out who I could become when I had to rely on myself." Maya had reached the same conclusion I'd arrived at months earlier. The crisis had been necessary, even beneficial in the long term. We'd both needed to learn lessons about accountability and boundaries that couldn't be taught gently, could only be absorbed through experience and consequences. "I'm proud of who you've become," I told her, meaning it completely. "I'm proud of who we've both become. We figured out how to love each other without enabling each other, how to be supportive without being codependent." It was true. We learned to be sisters in a way that strengthened rather than weakened us both, that encouraged growth rather than stagnation. Maya had developed the skills and confidence to handle her own life, while I'd learned to offer support without sacrificing my own needs or principles. The relationship we'd built wasn't the one we'd inherited from childhood, but it was more honest and ultimately more loving. We respected each other as adults capable of making good choices and handling the consequences of poor ones. We'd learned that trust was earned through consistent behavior rather than demanded through family obligation. Maya had become someone who could be counted on in crisis and celebration alike, while I'd become someone who could maintain appropriate boundaries without sacrificing genuine care and connection. We'd both learned that maturity meant taking responsibility for our own choices and allowing others to take responsibility for theirs. 5 years later, Maya would be promoted to branch emcristiger, and I would be selected for a command position that required the highest security clearance. Both achievements were possible because we'd learned to prioritize integrity and accountability over comfort and accommodation. We discovered that respect, for ourselves and others, required consistent standards and clear boundaries. The classified device incident had ended one version of our relationship and begun another. The new version was built on mutual respect, clear expectations, and the understanding that love sometimes required difficult choices. Maya had learned to earn trust rather than assume it, while I'd learned to maintain boundaries rather than automatically accommodate others' needs. We were both better sisters and better people for having navigated that crisis honestly. Maya's growth had allowed her to build meaningful relationships and professional success, while my boundary setting had allowed me to maintain both personal integrity and career advancement. We learned that accountability and love weren't competing values, but complementary aspects of healthy relationships. The story had become part of our family history, evidence that people could change dramatically when circumstances required it. Maya told it as a story about learning to respect other people's boundaries and take responsibility for her own choices. I told it as a story about the importance of maintaining professional standards even when personal relationships made that difficult. Both versions captured important truths about growth, accountability, and the complex relationship between love and boundaries. Maya had learned that respect was earned through actions rather than assumed through relationships, while I had learned that maintaining standards was ultimately more loving than constantly accommodating poor behavior. We'd both discovered that real love sometimes required difficult choices, that protecting someone from consequences could actually prevent them from developing the skills and character they needed to thrive. Maya had become someone capable of handling serious responsibilities because she'd been required to face serious consequences. I'd become someone capable of maintaining necessary boundaries because I'd learned that love and accountability were compatible rather than contradictory. The relationship we'd built was more mature and sustainable than the one we'd inherited, based on mutual respect rather than automatic accommodation. Maya had learned to value what I offered without taking it for granted, while I'd learned to offer support without sacrificing my own needs or principles. We'd both grown into people capable of healthy relationships built on trust, respect, and appropriate boundaries. Years later, when Maya was considering marriage and I was preparing for my next deployment, we could discuss major life decisions as equals rather than as rescuer and rescued. Maya had developed the judgment and self-reliance to make important choices independently, while I'd learned to offer support without trying to control outcomes I couldn't influence. I used to think growing up meant becoming more like you, Maya told me during one of our conversations. Now I think it meant learning to be responsible for my own choices while still caring about how they affect people I love. It was a perfect summary of the maturity we'd both developed through crisis and consequence. Maya had learned to balance individual responsibility with consideration for others, while I'd learned to balance personal loyalty with professional obligations. We'd both discovered that integrity required consistent principles applied fairly across all relationships and circumstances. The classified device incident had been the catalyst for growth we'd both needed, but neither of us had been able to initiate independently. Maya had required real consequences to develop accountability, while I'd required a crisis to learn the importance of maintaining boundaries with people I loved. The incident had forced us both to choose between comfortable patterns and necessary growth. We'd chosen growth, and both of us were better for it. Maya had become someone who could be trusted with serious responsibilities, while I'd become someone who could maintain professional integrity without sacrificing personal relationships. We'd learned that respect and accountability were prerequisites for healthy relationships rather than obstacles to them. The story of Maya's arrest and my choice to report her had become a touchstone for both of us, a reminder that difficult decisions could lead to positive outcomes when they were made for the right reasons. Maya had learned that actions had consequences beyond immediate intentions, while I'd learned that love sometimes required allowing people to face the results of their choices. We'd both discovered that maturity meant taking responsibility for our own growth rather than expecting others to accommodate our limitations. Maya had developed the skills to handle adult responsibilities because she'd been required to do so, while I'd learned to maintain appropriate boundaries because I'd seen the cost of failing to do so. The relationship we'd built was based on mutual respect earned through consistent behavior rather than assumed through family connection. Maya valued what I offered because she understood its worth, while I trusted her judgment because she'd proven it reliable. We'd both learned that healthy relationships required ongoing effort and attention rather than automatic accommodation. Looking back, the incident had been exactly what both of us needed to become the people we were capable of being. Maya had needed to face real consequences to develop real accountability, while I'd needed to maintain firm boundaries to learn the difference between love and enabling. We'd both grown through the crisis into people capable of mature, respectful relationships. The lessons we'd learned extended far beyond our sisterly relationship. Maya applied her new understanding of accountability and respect to all her relationships, building a life based on earned trust rather than assumed accommodation. I applied my boundary-setting skills to maintain appropriate limits in both personal and professional contexts. We'd both discovered that integrity was indivisible, that the principles governing our most important relationships should be consistent with those governing all our relationships. Maya had learned to be someone who could be counted on by anyone, while I'd learned to maintain standards that protected both my values and my responsibilities. The story had taught us that love and accountability were complementary rather than competing values, that respect was earned through consistent behavior rather than demanded through relationship status. Maya had become someone worthy of trust and respect, while I'd become someone capable of maintaining appropriate boundaries without sacrificing genuine care. In the end, the classified device incident had been a gift disguised as a crisis. It had forced both of us to grow in ways we'd been avoiding, to develop skills we'd been neglecting, and to build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than automatic accommodation. Maya had learned accountability, and I had learned boundaries. Both lessons had made us better sisters and better people. The ripple effects of our transformation continued to spread through our extended family and social circles. Our parents, who had initially been critical of my decision to report Maya, gradually came to understand the necessity of what had happened. Mom's perspective shifted most dramatically during a family dinner 2 years after the incident. "I was wrong to be angry with you," she told me quietly while Maya was in the kitchen. "I thought you were choosing your job over your sister, but I can see now that you were choosing what would help her grow. She's become someone I can be proud of in ways I never expected." Dad's evolution was more gradual, but equally significant. He'd always seen Maya as fragile, someone who needed protection from life's harder realities. Watching her develop competence and confidence had challenged his assumptions about both his daughters. During my promotion ceremony, he pulled me aside with tears in his eyes. "I never understood what you were trying to teach us about responsibility and consequences. I thought we were just being good parents by making things easier for Maya. But she's stronger than we gave her credit for, and you were braver than we realized." The family dynamic had shifted permanently. Maya was no longer treated as the child who needed constant protection, while I was no longer automatically expected to provide that protection. We'd all learned to see each other more clearly, to appreciate individual strengths rather than assuming predetermined roles. Maya's transformation had inspired changes in her friend circle as well. Sarah, who had been burned by Maya's borrowing habits in the past, became one of her closest confidants after witnessing her consistent growth. Their friendship deepened as Maya learned to be truly present for other people's challenges rather than constantly seeking attention for her own. "She listens now," Sarah told me during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "Really listens, not just waiting for her turn to talk about herself. And when she offers advice, it's actually thoughtful rather than just dramatic." The professional world had noticed Maya's development too. Her supervisor at the bank had recommended her for leadership training after observing her ability to handle difficult customers and complex situations with patience and sound judgment. Maya had discovered that competence was its own reward, that the satisfaction of solving problems was more lasting than the temporary high of being rescued from them. "I never realized how good it would feel to fix things myself," Maya told me during one of our regular check-ins. "When I resolve a difficult situation at work, I feel this sense of accomplishment that I never got when other people solved my problems for me." My own career had benefited from the lessons learned through Maya's crisis. The leadership skills I developed in staging that situation, making difficult decisions under pressure, maintaining clear boundaries while showing compassion, had been noticed by my superiors. Colonel Martinez had specifically cited my handling of the security breach as evidence of mature judgment when recommending me for advanced training. "You demonstrated that you could separate personal feelings from professional obligations without becoming callous or detached," he'd written in my evaluation. "That's the kind of balanced leadership we need at higher levels of command." The incident had become a case study in my unit, though the personal details were kept confidential. Other officers dealing with family-related security concerns had consulted with me about maintaining appropriate boundaries while still caring for loved ones. I'd learned that my experience wasn't unique. Many military families struggled with the tension between personal loyalty and professional duty. Maya and I had begun speaking at a support group for military families, sharing our story as an example of how relationships could survive and strengthen through crisis. Maya talked about learning to respect boundaries and take responsibility for her choices, while I discussed the importance of maintaining standards even with people you love. The hardest part was realizing that protecting someone from consequences wasn't actually protecting them. I'd told one group of spouses and siblings. It was preventing them from developing the skills they needed to protect themselves. Maya had added, and the hardest part for me was accepting that my intentions didn't matter as much as my impact. I had to learn that wanting to be a good sister meant actually being thoughtful about how my actions affected her life and career. These presentations had been healing for both of us, a way to transform our painful experience into something that could help others navigate similar challenges. Maya had developed genuine empathy for the family members of service personnel, understanding for the first time the pressure and responsibility that came with loving someone in a high-stakes profession. The long-term effects of our growth had been profound and unexpected. Maya's relationship with money had changed completely. She learned to live within her means and save for things she wanted rather than impulsively taking what was available. Her romantic relationships had improved as she attracted partners who valued stability and authenticity rather than drama and neediness. "I'm dating someone new," Maya had told me recently. "He's an engineer, very methodical and honest. 2 years ago, I would have found him boring. Now I find his consistency incredibly attractive." I'd met David during a family barbecue, and the contrast with Maya's previous boyfriends was striking. He treated her as an equal partner, expected her to contribute to decisions and planning, and showed no interest in being her rescuer or problem solver. Maya had risen to meet those expectations, demonstrating judgment and reliability that impressed everyone who knew her history. "She's become someone I can count on," David had told me privately. "Not just for emotional support, but for practical things. She follows through on commitments and prestiges her responsibilities well, thinks before she acts." I never would have believed that was possible based on the stories she tells about her past. My own relationships had evolved similarly. I'd learned to surround myself with people who respected boundaries and took responsibility for their own growth. The experience with Maya had taught me to recognize the warning signs of entitlement and irresponsibility early, to address them directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. The classified device incident had occurred 7 years ago now, and both Maya and I had built lives that reflected the lessons we'd learned. Maya had been promoted to regional M-Christager, overseeing multiple bank branches and training new employees in customer service and professional development. Her ability to hold people accountable while still being supportive had made her exceptionally effective at developing talent. I'd achieved the command position I'd been working toward, leading a unit responsible for protecting sensitive installations and personnel. The judgment and boundary-setting skills I'd developed through Maya's crisis had prepared me for the complex decisions required in that role. I'd learned to balance competing priorities and maintain standards under pressure. Our relationship had become a model for other siblings dealing with similar challenges. Maya's transformation proved that people could change dramatically when they were required to face real consequences, while my boundary setting demonstrated that love and accountability could coexist. We'd both learned that respect was earned through consistent behavior rather than assumed through family connection. The story we told now was one of redemption and growth, of two sisters who'd learned to love each other better by loving each other differently. Maya had become someone worthy of trust and respect, while I'd become someone capable of maintaining appropriate limits without sacrificing genuine care. We'd both discovered that maturity meant taking responsibility for our own choices while still caring about how they affected people we loved. Looking back, neither of us could imagine who we might have become if that crisis hadn't forced us to grow. Maya might have continued living impulsively, burning through relationships and opportunities while expecting others to clean up her mistakes. I might have continued enabling her behavior, sacrificing my own needs and principles while telling myself it was love. Instead, we'd both become people capable of healthy, mature relationships built on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries. Maya had learned that actions have consequences beyond immediate intentions, while I'd learned that love sometimes requires difficult choices. Both lessons had made us not just better sisters, but better people in every aspect of our lives. The classified device that had once threatened to destroy our relationship had ultimately saved it, forcing us to confront patterns that weren't working and develop skills we'd been avoiding. Maya had learned accountability, and I had learned boundaries. Both of us had discovered that respect and love weren't competing values, but complementary aspects of healthy relationships. 7 years later, we could both say with certainty that the crisis had been worth it. We'd built something better from the wreckage of our old dynamic, creating a relationship based on truth rather than convenience, respect rather than accommodation. Maya had become someone who could be counted on, while I'd become someone who could maintain necessary standards without sacrificing compassion. We'd both learned that real love sometimes required letting people face the consequences of their choices, and that growth often required discomfort, but was always worth the price. Thanks for sticking with me. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a boundary win. Quick questions for you. Have you ever had to choose duty over family or report someone you love? Where do you draw the line between helping and enabling? What would you have done in my place the moment that text came in? Has a public consequence ever changed a private relationship for you? Drop your answers in the comments. I'm reading them all.